Sunday, November 5th, beginning at noon Eastern, on Book TV. He's a world-renowned inventor of computer-based musical instruments and author of several books on artificial intelligence, including The Age of Intelligent Machines, The Singularity is Near, and his bestseller, The Age of Spiritual Machines. Join our live 3-hour discussion as Book TV's In-Depth welcomes Ray Kurzweil, Sunday, November 5th at noon Eastern, on C-SPAN 2.
Now, former Democratic presidential nominee George McGovern and former State Department Policy Planning Council appointee William Polk, they suggest a gradual strategy for bringing American troops home from Iraq in their new book, Out of Iraq. This is an hour 45 minutes.
As you may know, there are rules of debate in the Congress of the United States. And I hope that before I introduce our distinguished guests, you will allow me to, as we would have said in the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to proceed for such time as I may consume. And I'd like now to, before I introduce our eminent speakers, I cannot resist, before so august a body, giving you the following statement written by a man, a very famous Republican, once President of the United States. And listen to what he said, and I quote, "The President is merely the most important among the large number of public servants. He should be supported or opposed exactly to the degree which is warranted by his good conduct or bad conduct, his efficiency or inefficiency in rendering loyal, able, and disinterested service to the nation as a whole. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary that there should be full liberty to tell the truth about his acts, and this means that it is exactly necessary to blame him when he does wrong as to praise him when he does right. Any other attitude in an American citizen is both base and servile. To announce that there must be no criticism of the President or that we are to stand by the President, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public." Theodore Roosevelt, 1918. You see what membership in the National Arts Club can do? Ladies and gentlemen, I count it a privilege to be able to present to you this evening two distinguished Americans who will discuss with you their new book, Out of Iraq, A Practical Plan for Withdrawal Now. Our first speaker is someone I have known for many years, the son of a Wesleyan Methodist minister, and I'm a Methodist too. Both of us, as members of Congress, were delegates many years ago to an international assembly of the World Council of Churches meeting in Uppsala, Sweden. A native of South Dakota, he studied at Dakota Wesleyan University, but his education was interrupted by World War II. A B-24 bomber in Europe, he flew 35 combat missions, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he finished his studies at Dakota Wesleyan University, went on to Garrett Seminary for a year, then Northwestern University, from which he earned MA and PhD degrees in American history and government. He returned to Dakota Wesleyan to teach history and political science, but then plunged into politics, leading the South Dakota Democratic Party. He was elected to Congress in 1956 and re-elected in 1958. As I was myself first elected to the House of Representatives in 1958, he and I were for a brief time colleagues. After he lost his first race for the U.S. Senate in 1960, President Kennedy appointed him first director of the Food for Peace program, from which position he oversaw the donation of millions of tons of food to developing countries. He was then elected to the Senate in 1962 and re-elected in 1968 and 1974. In the Senate, he served on the committees on agriculture, nutrition, forestry, foreign relations, and the Joint Economic Committee, and was a champion of nutrition programs. In 1972, he was selected by the Democratic Party as our nominee for president. I remember that convention well because I was a delegate. In 1976, President Gerald Ford named him a United Nations delegate to the General Assembly, and in 1978, President Jimmy Carter appointed him a UN delegate for the special session on disarmament. After leaving the Senate in 1980, he was a visiting professor at a number of universities. He served as president of the Middle East Policy Council for 7 years and was then appointed by President Clinton ambassador to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. Indeed, in 2001, he was appointed the first UN Global Ambassador on Hunger. In my office in Washington Square is a photograph of me with our Speaker and another United States Senator with whom I also served in the House of Representatives, Bob Dole. What brought these two senators together across party lines, those were the days, was their common commitment to fighting hunger in the world. Our Speaker has received many honorary degrees and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, bestowed upon him by President Clinton in 2000. As President Clinton said, George McGovern is one of the greatest humanitarians of our time. He still imparts to us the power and the courage of his convictions. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present to you the co-author of Out of Iraq, A Practical Plan for Withdrawal Now, the Honorable George McGovern.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, my longtime colleague in the Congress and friend John Bradamus, President James, and my co-author Bill Polk, and all the members and friends of the New York Arts Club. It's reassuring to know that John Bradamus and President James and I are all Methodists. I read the other day that being a Methodist won't save you from sin, but it will take the fun out of it. And in that, I asked Bill Polk, who I regard as a dear friend and a much admired one, if he had any religious affiliation. He says, well, I'm still looking around. But in this same journal that told the merits of Methodism, some other wit had said that here is the best definition of an atheist that he has found. I'm not assuming that Bill is an atheist, such a devout man, but an atheist, said this wit, is a guy who can sit in the grandstand and watch Notre Dame, John Bradamus' school, and Southern Methodists play a football game and not care who wins. I first really got to know Bill Polk at his lovely home over in southern France. These beautiful people down here, some of them were at the New Year's Eve party too. And I've come to an increasingly high regard for him. I worked for 6 years after I left the United States Senate as president of the Middle East Policy Council in Washington. In a nutshell, what that council held is that the United States should try to maintain good relations with both Israel and the Arab countries in the Middle East, which is what I've always believed. And Bill Polk had written a great book shortly before I took that post called The United States and the Arab World. And I've respected his expertise and his authority on all matters relating to the Middle East ever since. It was such a balanced and insightful volume that it made a great impression on me, which has grown with the years. In this little book that we have written, which is entitled Out of Iraq, and then the subtitle tells you what it's really about, A Practical Plan for Withdrawal Now. We don't mean tonight. We're not, we'll immediately be accused of being part of the cut and run argument. As John Bradham said, I was a bomber pilot in the Second World War. I lost my navigator in that effort. I had one member of the crew savagely wounded by a piece of anti-aircraft metal. We had to leave him in Italy when the war ended. So I don't want anyone suggesting that I'm some kind of a weakling, unafraid to stand up for this country's interests. I've never had 1 hour of regret for the role that I played in World War II in helping in a small way to smash Hitler's war machine. And we're not deserting our troops. It's our love for those young Americans that motivates in considerable part our determination to get them out of this hellhole into which our leadership has taken them. And we don't desert Iraq in this book. We have a long list of carefully defined responsibilities that the United States owes to the people of Iraq and that we owe to our own honor and our own values. I've always thought, if you'll forgive this nationalistic observation, that we Americans live in the greatest country on the face of the earth, and it's because of that that it's so painful for me to see what has happened to our country in the last few years. I grew up in a Republican Party family like just about everybody else in South Dakota. Until I came along, it was regarded as hopeless to run for high office as a Democrat in South Dakota. But my mother and father, who lived and died as Republicans, would be appalled at what has happened to the leadership of that once great party. The founder of the Republican Party, as you all know, was Abraham Lincoln, and their first candidate for the presidency, and perhaps the greatest president in American history. He said this in a letter to his law partner, William Herndon, way back in 1848. Lincoln had been elected to the Congress after several failed attempts at running for high office in 1846, but he only lasted one term because he opposed the war in Mexico. And this is what he wrote to his law partner, William Herndon. The provision of the Constitution giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. This, our Constitutional Convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly functions. And they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should have the power of bringing this oppression upon us. We had a couple of other quotes like that that Bill and I wanted to include on the fly leaf of this book, but we were overridden by our brilliant editors at Simon and Schuster. We wanted to give you a quote from Hermann Goering, who said after the trials that at the end of the war, and I won't quote it, but the gist of it was that rulers have always known how to get their countries into war. They just report that country A, B, or C is a mortal threat. Some of them might even have weapons of mass destruction. And you spread that word by means of propaganda. You pick the target, and you go to war. And the public goes along with it, reassured by their leaders that they're responding to a mortal threat. We wrote this book because neither one of us ever believed the United States was faced with a mortal threat in Iraq. After all, when Bush Sr. drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, incidentally, a war that I supported, we've known that ever since then we had Saddam Hussein cornered in his own little desert kingdom. And the truth is, he hasn't so much as stuck his big toe beyond the borders of Iraq since that crushing defeat he suffered in Kuwait. President Bush, I think wisely, President Bush Sr., some people refer to Bush the Greater and Bush the Lesser, but I wouldn't want to be that disrespectful to the President of the United States. But Bush Sr. knew that he had a mandate from the United Nations, from the NATO alliance, from the European Union, from virtually all the countries of the world, including most of the Arab countries. They all endorsed this, even Fidel Castro. It's hard to think of it. Even Sweden and Switzerland, which ordinarily remain neutral, weighed in against this invasion of Kuwait, an independent country. Actually, the circumstances of that war, we have later learned, were not quite as clear-cut as they seemed at the time. We know, among other things, that the American ambassador in Iraq was instructed to tell Saddam Hussein that we were not fundamentally interested in a border conflict between two or more Arab states. That's something they should work out on themselves. And incidentally, that was the position that many members of the Senate held to. That war resolution, even to go into Iraq, only carried by one vote. The majority of the Democrats, practically all of them, wanted to wait 6 months and press for an Arab solution. That also happened to be the unpublished position of General Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So even that war, like most wars, had some serious questions about it. But nonetheless, I felt it was an effort that was worthy of support because it drove one clear-cut aggressor out of somebody else's country. But President Bush Sr. had the wisdom not to plunge into an invasion of Iraq. He was criticized for that by these neoconservatives who've been festering in the wings ever since. They desperately wanted an invasion of Iraq, not simply to expel the Iraqi army from Kuwait, but to go right to Baghdad and dump Saddam Hussein. And that's what Bush Jr. did 10 years later, to go into a country that was no threat to us, not the slightest threat. They had no air force, they had no navy, their army was smashed in the first Gulf War. There was not the slightest danger to the American people from Iraq. And when 9/11 occurred, President Bush knew from talking with his intelligence people who carried that out. It wasn't the Iraqis. It was Osama bin Laden, this wealthy religious fanatic in Saudi Arabia who recruited 19 young men from Egypt and from Saudi Arabia, no Iraqis, to seize 4 American airplanes and fly them into the sides of American buildings. You have to wonder what it is that drives young people. These were not uneducated boys and men. What drives them to fly an airplane into the side of a building, knowing they're going to be the first ones to die? I never flew a bombing mission that I wasn't scared out of my shoes by the prospect of being shot down. But how do you get a young person to hit a big building at high speed, knowing they're going to be turned into hamburger in an instant's time? I heard Karl Rove say the other day, let me tell you the difference between Democrats and Republicans. When the 9/11 attack occurred, the Democrats said, why do they do this? What drives this? We Republicans went to war. That's the difference. We're not afraid to go to war. This was said by people that have never been near a battlefield and never will be. That's one of the things that used to irk me in those long years we were in Vietnam, some 30 years, 10 years helping the French to a losing effort to smash the independence movement in Vietnam, and then 20 years with us attempting to order affairs in Vietnam. We were told during that time that if we pulled out of Vietnam, there would be a bloodbath in that country of unimaginable consequences. We finally took our army out. The Vietnamese became our friends almost overnight. It's not going to be that simple in Iraq because of the insurgency that the presence of our army there has set out. You have Sunnis killing Shiites, Shiites killing Sunnis, the Kurds wanting to pull out entirely. So neither our continuing presence nor our withdrawal is going to be without tragedy. But what drives this insurgency? I think the top American military men, our top diplomats, our top historians and students of Iraq like Bill Polk, they all agree that the insurgency is driven by the presence of a foreign army in Iraq. Us, we're the ones with 140,000 troops. We're the ones that bombed the infrastructure of Iraq to the point where many Iraqis haven't seen a light bulb since the early part of the war effort. No sanitary water, the bridges and tunnels and other things smashed. So we think the time has come to put an end to this. We honestly believe from our studies that the thing that is driving this murderous insurgency in Iraq, which was not there until we put our army into that country. Saddam Hussein was a first-class SOB, but he did keep the lid, just as Tito did in Yugoslavia. A brutal tyrant, but he did keep the lid on these dissident elements. People tell us that if we pull out, Iraq is going to go into a civil war. Well, what's going on now if it's not the bloodiest kind of civil strife? And besides, who appointed the United States, the #1 military power in the world, who appointed us to dictate events in Iraq? You know, after we achieved our independence from the British, which was driven in considerable part because the colonists were rejecting these British troops in the colonies. After we achieved that independence, it was only a few years before we fell into a civil war in which 600,000 young Americans killed each other, by far the bloodiest war in American history. That may happen in Iraq. Bill Polk and I don't have the authority or even the wisdom to know what's going to happen after an American withdrawal. But what we do know is that the thing that's driving this bloody insurgency is the American army stationed in Iraq. And if we pull out at least that cause of the instability, at least that cause of civil strife will disappear. So I think, like many of you in this room, we've long ago come to the conclusion that sending the American army into the Arabian desert was a dreadful mistake, at least as much of a blunder as the plunge into the Vietnamese jungle many years ago. I used to tell my 4 daughters, when they got discouraged about all the speeches I had delivered almost daily on the Senate floor about Vietnam, well, there's one good thing about this. You know, even bad things in history usually have at least one positive benefit. We'll never again do this anywhere in the world. Now here we are as we meet here tonight, and these young men over there dying from enemies they can't see, from bombs that go off in the ditches and on the bridges. And the Iraqi people, God only knows, we've lost over 2,600 young Americans. If you add in the ones we've lost in Afghanistan last week, the number of young American soldiers killed went beyond the number who died here in New York when the World Trade Center was destroyed. But we have to think once in a while about the Iraqi people. They have children, they have dreams, they have a yearning for a decent life, even as we do. And what we have done is to pretty much smash that country. We've seen good estimates, and Bill and I worked hard to try to get the facts on this. You know, all during the Vietnam War, we used to get the body count every night on television. Do you remember that? 139 Vietnamese died today, and we were supposed to applaud. The Army learned something from that. They haven't published anything on the casualties in Iraq, but the best estimates that we find indicate that upwards of 100,000 Iraqis, mostly innocent men, women, and children, have been destroyed in this war. So we think the time has come to withdraw. What both of us have heard as we've gone around the country is that most Americans agree that the war was a mistake. Bill, I think the latest poll shows that about 81% of Americans now think the war was a mistake. This miserable little cell phone, it never works when I want it to work. But, anyway, we estimate that probably upwards of 100,000 Iraqis have lost their lives in this war. And by the way, there's very little attention given, even in the history books, to the fact that 2 million Vietnamese died in that conflict. We all mourn the loss of these 58,000 young Americans. It's impossible for me to walk by that black marble wall in Washington with those 58,000 names without choking up. It's so sad. But you put that against the 2 million Vietnamese who were slaughtered in that war, and it's a sobering thought. As Jefferson said, when I consider that God is just, I tremble for my country. What we have done, I haven't yet talked about, and that's how to get out in a way that will contribute in some way to stabilizing the situation in Iraq and at least turning the country back to their halves. They haven't done too hot a job sometimes governing that country, but we've got our own problems. At times we're disappointing in how we handle our democracy. So Bill Polk's going to tell you how to get out. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much, Senator. Our next speaker is someone I have also known for many years. We first met in Washington when I was in Congress, and he was a member of the Policy Planning Council in the Department of State. He was then responsible for planning American policy for much of Africa and Asia, and for a number of specialized issues such as development, refugee problems, cultural exchanges. He also served on what was called the Crisis Management Committee during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like me, he studied at both Harvard and Oxford universities, earning degrees at both institutions. He studied as well at the Universidad Nacional de Mexico, the Universidad Nacional de Chile, the University of Baghdad, and the American University of Cairo. In 1965, he left government service to become a professor of history at the University of Chicago, where he established the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and in 1967 also became president of the Adlai Stevenson Institute of International Affairs. As I had, following my own first unsuccessful campaign for Congress in 1954, served on the staff of Adlai Stevenson in charge of research on issues during Stevenson's second presidential campaign, that is yet another link, I feel, with our speaker. He taught at Harvard University from 1955 to 1961, when President Kennedy appointed him to another important position. During the 1967 Middle Eastern War, he was called back to the White House, where he served as an advisor to McGeorge Bundy, former head of the National Security Council, who was the President's representative during that crisis. Our speaker has written a number of books on foreign affairs and American history. Some of you have seen his book, Understanding Iraq, which was described by The Economist as by far the most absorbing and disturbing of the many recent books, and has the authority that comes from formidable knowledge. The Washington Post said it should be required reading. Another of his books is The Birth of America, which has also received great praise. Publishers Weekly described it as a dazzling social history. Our speaker was kind enough recently to give me a book he had written nearly a decade ago, Neighbors and Strangers, The Fundamentals of Foreign Affairs, which I strongly recommend to you as brilliantly written and is an enlightening study for anyone who follows foreign affairs seriously. The book that brings us together today, of which, as you know, he is co-author with our other distinguished speaker, is entitled Out of Iraq, A Practical Plan for Withdrawal Now. I have been reading it, and I unreservedly recommend it to you as required reading, all the more so as we are now on the eve of congressional elections. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present to you Dr. William R. Polk.
I want to tell you that I have had one occasion worse than this to start a talk. I was asked to give a talk one time to a small group in the Middle West, and immediately before me was Miss America. So I will have to rush right into what I'm going to say. we have little time, and I have a lot to tell you about. What I'm really concerned about is that all the writing that I have seen, all the public debate that has come out, has talked about the various mistakes we've made, the amount of money we're spending. I'll tick off a few of these things: $237 million a day, $10 million an hour, rising at 30% a year, estimated at out-of-pocket expenses of $102 billion for this year. But the real costs to our society are far greater than that. They have been projected at approximately $1 to $2 trillion over the course of this decade. The human cost, as George McGovern pointed out, was 2,600 American dead, 40,000 severe psychological problems that have to be treated for probably the rest of their lives. Depleted uranium has caused cancer in an unknown number of people. Some 50,000 people have suffered multiple concussions that will cause them to have severe headaches and memory loss and other things most of their lives. In addition, of course, to that, as Senator McGovern pointed out, the estimates run to something like 100,000 Iraqis killed and perhaps 40,000 or so severely wounded. Property damage, nobody really knows yet, but perhaps as much as $100 billion. In addition to that, a thing which has disturbed me a great deal from my study of guerrilla warfare is what I think of as the dehumanizing aspect of a guerrilla war. It's been estimated that 1 in every 7 soldiers and 1 in every 4 Marines killed a civilian during the Iraq War. And that is a line beyond which people pass with very great damage to their psyches, to their sense of moral rectitude, and it's something that is certainly going to affect our society for many years into the future. In addition to all of these things is a tremendous growth of hatred for America in most of the world. We have seen public opinion polls that have borne that out year after year. And an interesting aspect, a frightening aspect of them, is that for many years, the public opinion polls showed that people liked, indeed loved America, trusted America, but felt that our government was perhaps less admirable. The most recent public opinion polls showed that even in England, our very old ally, the line that people used to draw between the public and the government has been largely erased. And now Americans are really regarded with great fear and great trepidation in much of the world. So it seems to me that the simple summary of all these things is that whatever else one says about it, Iraq is far too expensive in every term for Americans to stay. And the most fascinating thing to me is what's happened in the change of the American attitude. It used to be the case when I was in government that the civilians, the people that I dealt with, were always trying to restrain the military people. The military were the hawks, the civilians were the doves. Today we find exactly the opposite has come about. The chiefs of the armed forces are almost uniformly trying to hold back the so-called chicken hawks, who, as Senator McGovern pointed out, have rarely ever seen any dangerous combat themselves, but who are gung-ho about warfare everywhere. But those who know what warfare really is about are trying very hard to make us realize that war is not the solution to many of the world's problems. So what we've tried to do is to offer a plan, undoubtedly an imperfect plan, but the best one that we've been able to come up with, or indeed that anybody else has come up with, because it is the only plan on the table that anybody can talk about and come from, of how we could get out with the least possible damage to ourselves, to the Iraqis, and to our worldwide position. There will be damage. There will be a difficult period. As Senator McGovern pointed out, after our revolution in America, we went through the same kind of thing. I have done a study of 12 guerrilla wars around the world, and every single one of them follows a pattern in which at the end of the war there is a jostling for power and position among the various factions. We can certainly expect that in Iraq. We can't stop it. We can't stop it today with 140,000 troops in Iraq. We certainly won't be able to stop it at any time in the future. This is a job that the Iraqis will have to do themselves. But the main irritant, as Senator McGovern pointed out, is us. All of the guerrilla wars that I know about that have been fought have tended to wind down when the foreigners leave because the target was no longer there. And I was fascinated recently to find that that was not just the opinion of a former university professor, but it was the opinion of a current leader of a so-called public affairs team, a Marine colonel in Iraq. He said, when we leave, the fighting will stop because we're not there to be shot at. So it seems to me that what we have is a question of how we can put the elements together that do the best possible job under very difficult circumstances. We all know that it's far easier to fall into a mistake than it is to get out of one. So here's what we've come up with. The first thing we have to do is to set a timetable for withdrawal. We have to decide that we are indeed going to get out and convince the Iraqis that that's the case. Everyone wants us out in Iraq. This is not something that a faction is in favor of. And history teaches us that the occupier is more the problem than he is the solution to it. So what we need to do is to put on a date. And what I've tried to do, or what we've tried to do in every one of these issues, is to come up with a timetable, a cost, an estimate of what the possibilities of success or failure are, and what the downside risks are. So this is a carefully constructed program. There's nothing wishy-washy about it. Some of the numbers will undoubtedly be changed under circumstances, but it is an order of magnitude that I think makes sense. And the pieces of it all fit together. So if you'll forgive me, I'll run quickly through the pieces that I think we have to be concerned with. We have to recognize, as I say, that the immediate problem in withdrawal is going to be that there will be a period of chaos. This is inevitable. We can't stop it. We can't control it. But we can ameliorate it. And so what we have suggested is that there be the formation, under the control of the new Iraq government, of a United Nations stabilization force, as we've called it, perhaps some 15,000 men who will be armed with only small arms and will have a limited mission. They will be drawn from countries that are acceptable to Iraq. And I might mention that General Brent Scowcroft came up with the idea that they should come from Muslim countries. We've estimated the cost of this operation would be on the order of $500 a man, or roughly $6 billion for 3 years. 2 years, sorry. The important thing about that from our selfish point of view as a country is that that is approximately 2% of what it would cost us to do the same job. Everything that I'm going to tell you how many days of the war it would cost and what the estimate of the possibilities are. My estimate, or I believe it's fair to say our estimate of this from everything we've been able to find out, is that we would save some $200 billion and that there would be no more American casualties, and that the Iraqis would find this acceptable in terms of their national sentiments. We would not be humiliating them in the way that any country is humiliated by having a foreign army. During that period of time, Iraq would need to work much harder than it has on training a national police force. It's proven to be very difficult to do that because, as Senator McGovern pointed out, part of the problem of the period of our occupation has stimulated the angers and rivalries between the various factions. That is practically happens everywhere in every known guerrilla war. It is very bad today in Iraq. People are killing each other all the time. We have not been able to stop it, and we won't be able to stop it in the future, but the Iraqi government can move in that direction. We should, we believe, offer the Iraq government something on the order of $1 billion, that is 4 days' cost of the war, to help create a national police force. This police force would be supplemented by paramilitary people. This is a very old Iraqi tradition. It's not something we've invented, and everyone who's in Iraq today says it's not something we can even stop if we wanted to. These people grow out of the nature of the Iraqi society, and they are primarily aimed at protecting little enclaves of similar people of the same religion or the same ethnic background. However, they're a danger because if they move out of their neighborhoods, they tend to attack other people in other ethnic groups. Again, we can't stop that, but if we're not there, and if there is a stabilization force, and if there is a movement toward the creation of a police force, this will be assuaged, if not solved, over a period of time. We estimate that this will take about 2 years to do. The next issue with which we both strongly disagree is that the American policy has promoted the regrowth of an Iraqi army. Iraq needs an army like it needs a hole in the head. The army always in the past stopped the move toward democracy, toward public participation in government, toward the creation of an independent judiciary, an independent press, and so forth. If we can encourage the Iraqis not to put their assets in this direction, it would be very intelligent. We can't stop them from doing it. But today we're doing precisely the opposite. We're spending $2.2 billion to create an Iraqi army, which is detrimental to the Iraqi interest and detrimental to the American interest. What we could do, or what the Iraqis could do with such a force, is to transfer it into something like the American Corps of Engineers. And we think that the American government would be wise to offer something like 2 days' cost of the war to facilitate the growth of such an organization. That is $500 million. These numbers sound enormous to me, certainly, and I'm sure they do to most of you, but placed in the context of what the war is costing, they are really very small. I will give you an overall estimate of what this program will save if we go through with it. The next thing is that we're creating more or less permanent bases in Iraq. And the Iraqis are terribly disturbed about that because that's what the British did during their time in Iraq. They created air bases throughout the country from which they could bomb and use poison gas against Iraqi dissidents. We had, over the last few years, some 100 bases in Iraq. We've apparently turned most of those over to the Iraqis, or at least the transfer of the title to them. But we're still working on what are called 14 huge remote bases. Some of them are indeed small cities with facilities for up to 20,000 people, airfields, Pizza Huts, PXs, everything that you can imagine. The most well-known of all these is the so-called Green Zone, which is in the center of Baghdad, which either has cost or will cost an estimated $1 billion. What we need to do in the course of this is to turn that over to the Iraqi government and replace the vast American diplomatic, in quotes, presence that we have there with a normal embassy. And we recommend that that could be done by December the 31st, 2007. Perhaps we could save some of the money that is being allocated to the Green Zone. And incidentally, even the congressional authorities looking at oversight on government activities were not able to come up with an exact figure of how much we were spending on these bases. The Pentagon has kept that secret even from the Congress. The next issue is that there are some 25,000 mercenaries in Iraq. They're not called mercenaries, they're called public defenders of one sort or another. That's a larger force than the British have in Iraq. a whole new industry has grown up to supply these people. We have troops from Fiji and troops from everywhere you can imagine all over the world, rather like the British Gurkhas were maintaining their empire in the past. This is a simple problem to solve. All we have to do is stop paying them. A much more complicated problem is the unexploded bombs and mines and depleted uranium that's scattered all over the country. I don't know if any of you know about depleted uranium. I didn't know very much about it either. But I learned when I was in the government many years ago that there was a move to create a heavier type of projectile that would penetrate a tank. And the heaviest material they could use for this was uranium after it had been used and was depleted. And the only problem is that it does continue to give off radioaction, so that people who handle it or people who are affected by it are apt to develop cancer. We think that at least one day's cost of the war needs to be devoted to do a complete survey to find out where all these things are in the country. There are millions of rounds of ammunition, many of which are not exploded yet. And if they're not found and dug up and destroyed, they will continue to kill Iraqis for at least a century ahead of us. And we should not leave this country in that kind of mess. We do have, it seems to us, a moral obligation to end that aspect of what we've been involved in. These, it seems to us, are the absolute essential actions. In addition to those, there are others that we think are very important and that we would be well advised to go into, and which would certainly serve our interest and move to create a better environment in the country. The first of these is a question of property damage. As I mentioned, the estimates run from 100 to $200 billion. We don't even know how much that is. So the first thing we have to do is to find some method of analyzing what really has been destroyed. Then after that, we have various precedents which we can go into. At the end of World War II, England and Germany, for example, made it possible for people to borrow money to rebuild what had been torn down. We think that the American contribution to this, when we find out what really is required, should be as generous as possible for a number of reasons. One is that it will tend to redound to the sense that America is, again, a moral country concerned with other people's well-being. It will also stimulate employment. And in many areas of Iraq, the unemployment rate is as much as 50%, which is socially destructive to any country. But we must begin with a survey, and we recommend that we allocate 4 days' cost of the war to that. That is $1 billion. Then there are the ugly monuments of war, blast walls, hundreds of miles of barbed wire. Much of that will be recycled normally by Iraqi civilians because they're desperate for building materials of one sort or another. But the U.S. should offer, it seems to us, 2 days' costs of the war, roughly $500 million, to handle the really difficult problems of this. There are some things that are not recyclable and that need to be removed. Next is the terrible destruction of the great cultural sites, like Babylon. We stationed a military unit right on top of the World Monument City, Babylon, where the troops, nice young boys who probably had never heard of Babylon and certainly didn't know where it was or what was going on or what had gone on there, filled up their sandbags with artifacts, dug trenches through the city, tore down walls when they were in the way of helicopter landing pads, various things like that. Baghdad was by no means the only place. You all know about the terrible destruction of the museum in Baghdad, which my daughter Milbury edited a wonderful book on. But the astonishing thing about Iraq is that it was the seedbed of our civilization. And it, over thousands of years, developed civilization after civilization, giving us writing, the sense of history, the sense of urban organization, the early beginnings of hydraulical engineering, many forms of artwork, wonderful aspects of civic engineering and buildings and so forth. Practically no place in the country can you put a shovel in the ground without turning up some kind of residue of the past. So we're allocating, or we are advocating the allocation of one day's cost of the war, $250 million roughly, to be used at the discretion of the Smithsonian Institution, the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, the British Museum, the World Monuments Fund, and the Iraq Museum to do what can be done at this late date to save what can be saved. I think it's definite that it's not to America's advantage to be remembered as yet another barbarian invader of this ancient land. The next thing is an independent audit. It's one of the curiosities of our rather grand approach to the world that we regard ourselves as moral, honest people, and that others are certainly dishonest and corrupt. The banana republic idea is something that all of us, I think, have grown up with. But actually, there are billions of dollars that have been either misallocated or have disappeared in the course of our occupation of Iraq. And when we set out to do this, I went around and asked a number of friends of mine who were in the accounting business how much it would cost to actually do an audit of Iraq. And my guess was it would be something like $10 million. Everyone laughed at me. And they said, even if you allocated $100 million, it's very unlikely that any American auditing firm would take the job because it is so much more complex than anything to do with Enron or any of the other scandals that have been done. Recently, as you probably heard, the Defense Department has ended a contract with a certain well-known organization headed or formerly headed by a major public figure in America for $1 billion of questionable charges. The next issue is, or I might say just to conclude that we think this may have to be done by some specially created organization of the American Congress or perhaps by the United Nations. The next issue is the civilian casualties and wounded people. And what we do now is we pay $400,000 to the family of an American who's been killed. The U.S. Congress, anticipating the war, authorized what they call condolence payments to Iraqis in the Iraq War Supplemental Appropriations Act. The estimates for the Iraqis' casualties, as I mentioned, run up to 100,000. Various estimates go from 30,000 to 100,000 killed, 15,000 to 25,000 grievously wounded. Taking what are called unjustified deaths as a middle figure, say 50,000 killed and 20,000 wounded, and offering something like $10,000 each, would cost us 3 days of the war, or just about $700 million. This would do immense good economically and psychologically and would not buy us out of a bad situation, but would indicate the good faith of our country. It's something that we have always prided ourselves on tremendously, and we think this would be a very cheap price to pay for the good that would come out of that. Iraq is a wounded society. It's gone through a terrible set of traumas going back a very long time, going back to British times and following with dictatorship after dictatorship. So that civic institutions, which were quite strong in pre-British times, were broken down. Every little neighborhood in Iraq had its mosque or its synagogue or its church, its marketplace, its clinic, its graveyard, its water source, everything else that was a self-contained unit. And these things, particularly the schools, the British decided were inefficient and were backward. So they destroyed that aspect of public participation, which is the very essence of democracy, is My illustrious friend called it the grassroots of our system. And we must help the Iraqis, it seems to me, if we really care whether Iraq ultimately moves toward something beyond a dictatorship, to reestablish some sense of public participation. And that's the place to start. People need to be given the wherewithal to do what they need to do to run their own affairs. On the higher level of this, we have wonderful precedents to draw from. The Fulbright program, the Salzburg Seminar, various other things that we've done, bringing young students to America. There's so many things that we've done very well in this field. And we urge that something like 2 days' cost of the war be put toward that effort, roughly $500 million, for the training of teachers and journalists and judges and other civic workers. The grassroots organization and professional societies need to grow from these people, and it would be to the advantage of the Iraqi society and to us that we should do everything we can to encourage those Iraqis who've gone abroad, of which there are probably 100,000, to come back and contribute to the growth of the country. And we suggest that the way to go at this is to offer something like relocation allowances to roughly 10,000 people in the medical field and teaching and various other things that the country needs to get going again. The estimates that we've come up with are something like $50,000 for a family to move back to Iraq. And that enormous amount of money represents 2 days' cost of the war. Prisoners. We have had perhaps 60,000 people under American detention at one time or another. There's something like 14 to 16,000 today incarcerated. Many of those people have undoubtedly been maltreated. Many of them have been in prison for longer than a year without any charges brought against them. And we advocate that the prisoners of war be immediately released, and that those who have come from other countries, we should try through the United Nations to work out some system whereby they could find a safe haven where they would be off the danger list of the world and not capable of inflicting any harm anywhere. But we should remember that there are two horrible precedents that came out of the period around the Second World War of what to do about people who were like those people. France turned over all the people who'd come out of the Spanish Civil War to the Gestapo. We and the British turned over the Cossacks and various other Russians to the Soviet Union. And in both cases, they were simply all executed. We should not want our hands dirty with that sort of situation. So we can arrange, it seems to me, at no serious cost of any kind, that we can do what we can at this point to get out of the mistakes that were made then. The next issue is what to do about the oil contracts. The typical Iraqi feeling is that America went into Iraq for oil. Iraq has various estimates of the amount of oil. Numbers run as high as 300 billion barrels. The oil is very cheap to produce, it's very attractive, and under our occupation government, contracts were worked out with various American oil companies for extremely concessionary arrangements with Iraq that were very unfair. If we don't cancel those arrangements or allow them to be canceled, that will be a terrible point of contention far into the future. And we believe that the United Nations resolutions that have already been passed to this effect, numbers 1456 and 1493, must be implemented, and we must not put up any objection to the contracts being canceled. There will be no cost to the American government in this, but it will remove from contention one of the most difficult issues in Iraq's return to a normal situation. My last item for what to do about Iraq is in the field of public health. We were lucky that the United Nations Millennium Development Goals study gives an order of magnitude for rebuilding and new construction and training of personnel. I won't go into any great detail on this, but it goes through all the characteristics of the different specialities in medicine and nursing and other aspects of public health. And it comes to about 8 days of the cost of the war, roughly $1.7 billion. And it's extraordinary, it seems to me, that with that kind of the allocation of, as I say, 8 days of warfare, we could leave Iraq with a functioning public health system of world class. And I would remind you that that was where America really began in the Middle East. It was our building of schools and hospitals that gave us the enormous reputation and the credibility all over, not only the Middle East, but Africa and much of Asia, certainly in China, that made our country's mark in the world and made us beloved and respected everywhere. Lastly, I'd just like to raise 2 other issues that are not directly perhaps related to what I've said. It seems to me that one of the things that we should remember is that we need to express in some fashion condolence for the large number of Iraqis, pardon me, who've lost their lives in the war or whose families have been grievously harmed. This won't cost us anything, but it's a difficult thing, I think, for Americans to do. I don't know whether it's macho or whether it's pride or what it is. And it sounds like something that isn't really serious. One of my former colleagues at Harvard called it soft power. And I would remind you that even today, when Bill Carey and I went out to China, we went to Nanjing, and in Nanjing, the Chinese still remember the Japanese occupation, for which the Japanese have never apologized. And that is the most important single problem between these two very worldly, very practical people. And we should recognize that however we may feel about it, this is an enormously important psychological thing. We have harmed, whether for good, whether intelligently, whether for bad, whatever else, we have harmed Iraq grievously. And we should tell the Iraqis we're sorry that that happened. Finally, I have one point that I particularly owe to George McGovern in his usual sense of decency and compassion. He said, we have a debt to the young Americans who've given up a significant piece of their lives in this war. They need and deserve comprehensive rehabilitation, physically, emotionally, economically, in something like the GI Bill of Rights. As Abraham Lincoln, who he quoted earlier, said on another occasion, after our Civil War, he said, we need to bind the nation's wounds and to care for him who shall have borne the battle. The whole cost of this, and I will stop at this point, is really minimal. We can do everything that I have talked about for a relatively small amount of money, something like $12 billion. If we do that, we have a real possibility of saving something like $500 billion. This is a marvelous investment. And we think that's something that the country really needs to focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Polk, and also thank you again, Senator McGovern. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have a problem? Yeah, allow me to take charge of it, will you? I used to be the majority whip of the House. We'll now have time for a brief question and answer period, but I implore you, do not make speeches, just ask questions. And we'll alternate between the two senators. I'll ask the first question. Does either of our distinguished speakers have any comment to make on the commission dealing, as I understand it, with resolution of the Iraq situation by the committee chaired by former Secretary of State James Baker and my former Indiana colleague, Congressman Lee Hamilton.
Well, I'm glad we have this commission. These are mostly older people, as you doubtless have noted. I, too, have formed a council of elders. I recognize that there are old fools as well as younger ones, but it's interesting to note that President Bush Sr., his Secretary of State, James Baker, his National Security Advisor, General Scowcroft, all three of them were against sending the American Army into Iraq. Once in a while, it's worthwhile, I think, to consult older people who've been around for a while. When Bob Woodward, who somehow managed, beyond my comprehension, to get a 3.5-hour interview with President Bush, near the end of that interview, he said, "Well, Mr. President, who did you talk to before you decided to put the American Army into Iraq?" And before President Bush could reply, he said, "Did you talk to your father?" And the president said, "No, in a situation like this, it's better to talk to your father above." That frightens me because if God told President Bush to invade Iraq, bomb the daylights out of that country, and then leave the American Army there for years to come, he certainly sent a different message to the Pope, who strongly opposed this invasion of Iraq, as did the National Council of Churches and many of the leading rabbis and other religious leaders in the country. It's always dangerous to proclaim that what you want to do is God's will. That's pretty tricky. And I'm not ridiculing Bush's prayers or his religious life, whatever that might be, but I think that's been one of the problems with this current administration. They drape everything they do with a kind of a halo, as though to criticize them would almost be to defy the divinity. And I think it can get us into more trouble than it saves. I would much rather, instead of blaming this war on God, that President Bush had talked seriously to his father about the benefits and the possible hazards of invading a country like Iraq. Anyway, so much for that.
Thank you, George. Now, you have a question for Dr. Polk. Yes.
Do we not risk... Excuse me?
Here's a mic for you.
Okay, thank you. We heard all these sanguine statements about how we were going to be greeted by the people of Iraq as liberators, and clearly that was not true. But isn't it important to tell the American people, you know, I very much appreciate your putting this on the agenda, which is not on the agenda before the media or anywhere, really talking about what we are going to do now and raising the notion of withdrawing and how we can do that. But isn't it important to tell the American people that this choice may result in a very bad bloodbath there, and there may be even worse civil war, but to consider that in the context of our having to stay there for perhaps 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, it may be the least bad of all our terrible choices that this administration has put this country into.
Bill, I mean.
Maybe we ought to stay up here.
Yeah.
I think it's imperative that we tell the truth. We haven't been told the truth very much, and we haven't demanded that we be told the truth. I feel very strongly that, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. I think the buck stops with all of us as citizens. We're not really educated enough about the world. I was fascinated that recently the Roper organization did a poll for the National Geographic, and after 3 years of war, something like 6 out of every 8 or 9 young Americans didn't know where Iraq was. Never mind what kind of society it had or anything else. We have tried to say, this isn't going to be an easy transition. That would be very immoral and improper of us to say that. Of course it's going to be very difficult. We haven't been able to stop what's happening, and we won't be able to stop it in the future. But what we have, or what I have found in my study of guerrilla warfare, is that once the foreign element is removed, the war tends to wind down. And it does for a very simple reason. You remember that Mao Zedong described guerrilla warfare as, by analogy, with the fish in the sea. And the fish are the fighters, the sea are the people who support them and hide them and feed them and so forth. The fish will stop supporting or stop being supported by the sea if there is no foreign activity. And at that point, typically in a guerrilla war, some of the guerrillas, like Tito, become the leaders of the country. Others become outlaws, and when they become outlaws, the people turn against them, and the fighting stops. Now, there certainly is going to be a period, as I've stressed all along in what I had to say, and as we've stressed in this book, there's going to be a period of chaos. We're already in a period of chaos, so that there's no really new thing about it. But we have been very, very clear in what we've written that this is not going to be a simple turning of a switch. It's going to be a difficult thing, and it is inevitably going to be that, no matter what we do.
Yes, Miss.
This may seem naive, but in trying to put my mind around what you've said, which I think is fabulous, how do you do it? Do you make a declaration of, that's it, and we are now going to leave, but in the meantime we're going to sit down at a table with all the tribal, the religious people, how do you do this? And what do you say to these people? Do you make a statement of, this is what we're going to do, and then realizing that the chaos will happen, but you will continue on making this happen? I mean, the nuts and bolts, how do you do this?
Well, it's been done do you want to speak to that, George? It's been done a number of times. John very courteously mentioned that I was in charge of the American task force dealing with Algeria. What happened in that case, we were very lucky in that we had a strong man, de Gaulle, who said, we're getting out, and on such and such a date we're going to leave. And he withdrew the army. And I happened to be in Algiers the day that we brought in Ben Bella to take over the government. And there was a period of difficulty because there was typically insurgency split between the internal forces and the external forces, or the formal people and the informal people. And the first day, or the first week in Algeria, some 16,000 people were shot who had obviously collaborated with the French. And de Gaulle's government realized they couldn't stop it. The next week, there was no shooting. If you look at the Palestine episode, it was a similar situation. You look at Kenya, you look at the kicking out of the Germans from Yugoslavia. It was a very easy transition. Some of them are more difficult than others. I think Iraq is going to be very difficult. But one of the interesting things is that when we were trying to stabilize Afghanistan, one of the elements of the axis of evil, Iran, was our biggest helper. They helped us to negotiate a way to get the Taliban removed from the situation there. And I think we'd find that if we are clear and we convince people that we really mean to get out, and that means not only removing the troops but closing down the facilities that we have there and so forth, and doing these various other things that all fit into a coherent pattern, that we'd find that we could do it much faster than you might think.
Yes, sir. Yes, George.
Bill Polk and I are both historians. History isn't always a dependable guide to what to do in a situation because every circumstance is different. But when we wonder about the terrible things that are going to happen after we bring our army out of Iraq, we need to look honestly at what's going on now with the army there, the slaughter that takes place every day. And it might be worth just recalling that in those long years of our involvement in Vietnam, I can tell you, and Congressman Bradamus here will verify this, that almost every day on either the House floor or the Senate floor, someone would get up and make a fire-eating speech that if we pull out of Vietnam now, even though it might have been a mistake to go in there, if we pull out now, there will be a bloodbath of just incredible dimensions. The Viet Cong and the government in Hanoi will just slaughter people by the hundreds of thousands who were on the American side. That never happened. Once we got our army out of there, there were a few backbitings and people shot, but it was a handful compared to what was dying during the war. Now you can go to Vietnam, and it's a beautiful little country. You can lie on the beaches. You can go to first-class hotels. They'll receive Americans in a very warm way. I was there, I guess maybe 3 or 4 years ago when I was working for the United Nations with a mission of 7 or 8 people. We were treated with such friendship that I finally said, after answering questions from an audience about the size of this, everywhere we have gone, we've been received in such a friendly way. How come? We dropped more bombs on this little strip of jungle territory than were dropped by all the air forces of the entire world in the Second World War. And yet, why are we so warmly received? And the chairman of the meeting said, Senator, we never had anything against the American people. It was your government with which we had a quarrel. We've always admired the United States. They ticked off some of the great writers our country has produced and some of the great eloquent speeches and essays and so on. And I found that to be the case. And as Professor Polk said, Iraq is not a band of barbarians. It's referred to rightly as the cradle of civilization. And who knows, there's going to be some reprisals, whether we stay or whether we get out. They're killing each other now. And who knows whether it'll be worse or better. What we do know is that by taking our army out of there, we're removing the major cause of the upheaval and violence that's going on in that country. Now, if I could just take one more minute on the cheerful side. I saw an interview with Gore Vidal, the novelist, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he gave a pretty grim view of the drift of American leadership these days. And finally, the reporter said, well, Mr. Vidal, do you see any hope in the future? He says one thing, Newton's third law of physics. And the reporter said, well, I hate to say this, but I've kind of forgotten what Newton's third law was. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. He says, these people in Washington now have screwed things up so bad, they've moved the whole dialogue so far to the right, if Newton's law is still on the books, well, the way he put it, if Bush hasn't repealed Newton's third law, as he has half the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, then the great hope is that we'll get a reaction the other way. I give you that.
Thank you, Judge. Senator, I'll tell you, I had a telephone call from Vietnam yesterday from one of my former constituents, a woman who is from Goshen, Indiana, and she's been working there for several years with the support of the Mennonite Church and the Church of the Brethren to help train social workers to work with the disabled. She's working very closely with the Roman Catholic leaders in Ho Chi Minh City. She herself is blind, and I've been trying to help her. As a member of Congress, I worked in that field. I'm the author of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, and I'm touched by the fact that she writes and she speaks in such positive terms about her capacity to work in a country, in a community, in that city. That was the cause of so much anguish and grief in our country. Now, sir, I was about to recognize you.
Mr. Polk mentioned that there are 100,000 Iraqis killed and 30,000 wounded. That seems out of proportion, because I understand there were 3,000 Americans, but there are about 20,000 maimed and injured. The proportion doesn't seem right. If there are 100,000 killed, only 30,000 wounded?
I cannot speak to that subject. I don't know if Bill Polk can.
We don't honestly know, of course, exactly what these numbers are. The figure that I gave you comes from the British journal, The Lancet. And there was another British organization, because the American forces were instructed not to keep count of these people. Another figure used only the people who had been reported by two media outlets, and that figure was 30,000. But the 100,000 figure was what the Lancet did with a study all over the whole country in some 98 of what they call cluster groups, where they checked out the households and found out what people had happened. What is remarkable about the relatively small number of American casualties is that after every firefight, they were able to put, either to pick up the wounded and take them to a hospital somewhere else, or to treat them right on the spot. And what the doctors have reported is that what was different about this war was both that is to say, the medical attention was incredibly good, and people who would have died in earlier wars were saved. But the second thing is that people had an awful lot of the special kind of injuries that came about in guerrilla warfare, particularly chest intrusions, not so much bullets, but blast effects. So that I think we could say that of the 50 or so thousand other people who had various kinds of wounds, a very large portion of them would have died in the Second World War, for example. Those numbers are the best that we've been able to come up with, and the best that anybody has been able to come up with.
Thank you. Lee Volman.
Well, this may also be naive, but your president says that he is the decision maker. And wouldn't it in any way be possible that you could have 1 hour with him? Because then he would get not only a vision, but a real plan. And if he managed to do that, he would go over in history as a remarkable president. And I think that is something he would like. And first of all, it would really do something to this terrible situation which the whole world is now part of. Is there any way where the two of you can meet him for 1 hour?
Let me preempt Senator McGovern for just one thing that we actually mentioned in the book. He did convene a group of people to do exactly that. He got all the former secretaries of state and the former chiefs of the general staff together, and they all took a photograph, and the meeting lasted for 10 minutes.
Senator?
I think it's worth a try. It's one of the reasons I admire Lee Volkman. She's always on the right track on these big issues. It's probably worth a try, but I would remind you that he has a father, and he has his father's Secretary of State, and he has General Scowcroft telling him publicly that this was a big mistake to go into Iraq. I have no doubt at all that if we had President Bush Sr. here and his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor, we don't know what they would say publicly, but if it were off the record, I think they would feel very similar to the plan that Bill and I have outlined here. But I would add that it is worth a try.
And allow me to add to what the senator has said. I realize this is not a partisan gathering, but as one who 14 times was a candidate for election to the Congress of the United States, I observe that the way in which we approach these matters in the United States is elections. If I were in the House of Representatives, George, I'd say, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. We'll take a couple of more questions. Sumner?
I think that your plan, as you outlined it, is wonderful, you know, and the phases that you have. But the key question is, why can't we get out right now?
We've got a pretty rapid timetable. It's 6 months. It would begin in December of this year and would be all over by June of next year. I suppose it's going to take some time to reposition our forces and get them out of there. And it gives the Iraqis a little time to adjust to the fact that we're actually leaving. But it's probably about the best timetable we could market to the American public and the Congress. Even this they will call a cut and run tactic, although it's not that by any means. It's going to take some planning, too, to lay out the specific plans that we have proposed that go into effect as the withdrawal begins. Think back, if I can appeal to history again, at the end of World War II, a war in which we were attacked by the Axis powers. Nonetheless, almost immediately following the end of that war, we held out offers of assistance to the Germans, to the Japanese, to the Italians, and all the others, the so-called Marshall Plan and the .4 plan of President Truman. It was probably the wisest thing we could have done. Some historians believe that the seeds of World War II were sown in the way we treated the vanquished enemies in World War I, that we created an anger and a humiliation that was very skillfully exploited by Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo and other leaders of that period. This plan of ours will take a little while to put it into effect, and it's going to have some problems. There are going to be some days when we're kind of discouraged about it, but I do think it's the best thing I've come across as to how we can minimize the damage of a disengagement from Iraq. It's not really a disengagement from Iraq, it's a withdrawal of our armed forces. We're continuing to show an interest in the Iraqis, in helping them rebuild. It has to be their show, but we can put up some of the funding, we can offer other forms of assistance that will help to ameliorate the damage of the war.
This young lady.
Well, I thank you for making an effort to help somehow, because I think a large number of Americans are very frustrated and we are not informed. I mean, I have to watch BBC News to find out what's happening in my country. I'd like to know, though, if you've thought about repercussions in terms of the United States being infiltrated with very frustrated Shiites and Muslims that want to launch an attack on us in retaliation for all of the things, the lies that we told them, the people that have been really, the women have been, you know, abused. There's some atrocities that have never been reported to the American public. The soldiers, the U.S. soldiers tried to report it, tried to talk about it, and they were shut up. So do you think that we're prepared for retaliation?
Bill?
I have drawn the short stick, I think, on this. I think there's a very strong possibility of that. I think that we have to recognize that the longer we stay in Iraq, the greater the possibility is. If we had not engaged in an occupation, that problem wouldn't have arisen. If we're there for another 10 years, it's almost certain, it seems to me, that it will. But what we've tried to do is to try to regain some part of the moral ground on which we were standing. The more we talk about preemptive attacks on other countries, the more we deprecate other people's religions and call them, for example, Islamofascism and things like that, the more certain it is that people are going to seek some form of retaliation against us. I think that we have to continue to be vigilant in protecting ourselves, but I think that vigilance is itself a very limited thing. As has often been pointed out, the New York police force couldn't control the city of New York. Indeed, the whole United States Army couldn't control the city of New York if it weren't for the general feeling of the population that that's the right way to live. The British found that in our revolution. They put troops into Boston, and that's what triggered the American Revolution. And there was a long period in which some roughly a quarter of the American population was treated to what really amounted to terrorism by the other three quarters. And large numbers of people, as you know, left and went to Canada. There were tremendous fights back and forth. We were lucky in a sense at that time that there was no major external enemy like we will certainly face today if we keep on in Iraq. But the faster we get out, the more we try to implement the attempts to help the Iraqis get better, to get back to their standard of living, the more we create people who have some hope in the future, that's the way that those people will be controlled. We can't control them. We haven't been able to control them with all of our troops, but the Iraqis can control themselves if they want to, and the other Muslims the same way.
You have the last question.
First of all, I thank you both for creating a new vision for us to live with. But as three members of our society who have spent a great deal of time in the United States Congress environment, I ask you, what was the environment that created the decision to go into Iraq in the first place with no defense and no reaction to the kinds of decisions that were made? I was in the Security Council when Colin Powell was there, creating an argument that we all know was not factual or truthful. What is the environment that our leadership is providing that allows that to happen? And I would love to know, because you all have had a lot more experience than many of us, and you talked to your daughters and told them that it would not happen again, and I'm curious as to why it continues to happen again and again. And what can we do to prevent it for the future?
I think fear is the principal ingredient, the fear of being perceived as soft on a mortal enemy. You know, for 50 years after the end of World War II, we lived in the fear of communism. I always thought it was vastly overrated. We obviously had two different ideologies here in communism and capitalism, but I do know that the opposition to people like myself or Bill Polk was usually directed in that way when rival politicians appealed to the same constituency that we were weak on communism. And of course, Joe McCarthy was the ultimate example of how that fear can be vastly overrated to the point where it actually undermines the health of our political system. I think that same technique was used very skillfully by the powers that be following 9/11. The fear of terrorism, it immediately was called a war on terrorism, as though it were similar to World War I, World War II, and so on. And the Democrats and moderate Republicans really didn't stand up as well as they should have against that exaggerated fear. I'm critical of the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld regime. That's one regime I'd like to see replaced. But it's a fact that the Democrats haven't been very good either, or the moderate Republicans. They've been rather pallid and weak-kneed. Bill and I point out in our book that in addition to the Constitution itself, with its system of checks and balances, two other institutions were expected to be a check on misused executive power. One is the press. That's not mentioned in the Constitution, but we do have a free press. They haven't been very good in calling the present leadership to task. I don't know how many of you saw Bill Clinton explode in that interview with Chris Wallace. I liked that. I thought here's somebody that's finally going to challenge these Fox TV people and some of the others. But by and large, the Democrats have been pretty weak and flabby on this war issue. Lieberman's a classic example of that. I hope that the Democratic candidate wins over there. I don't have any malice personally towards Lieberman. He's a pleasant, decent man. But he's an example of what's wrong, I think. The other day I was doing an interview and a reporter asked me, well, Senator, what is the position of the Democratic Party as over against the Bush war policy? If you don't agree with this war, what is the Democratic alternative? I can usually wiggle out of questions, but I couldn't get out of that one because I don't know whether there is a Democratic position on the war that's much different. It is true that 22 Democratic senators voted against the war resolution, and 140 or 50 in the House, John, something like that voted against it. So there is a difference, but we're all over the place. I hear some prominent Democrats saying the answer in Iraq is to send in more troops. I don't agree with that. I think that just means more targets for the insurgents to shoot at. You are not going to overwhelm Iraq with military power. You can smash their army. That was over a few weeks' time. They were defeated militarily. But that's not going to answer the long-term problem any more than it did in Vietnam. As I said here earlier, it just astounds me as an old bomber pilot to know that we dropped more bombs on that one little strip of Vietnamese jungle than were dropped by the entire world, all the air forces of the world, in the Second World War, and yet the Vietnamese prevailed because they knew that it wasn't just military power that was going to decide where the people of that country stood. So anyway, it's hard to answer your question of why there hasn't been more outcry, but I think if there's any one cause of that is that politicians are fearful and the public is fearful, and we have masters whipping up that fear. I just about didn't come tonight when I tried to get on an airplane today in Salt Lake City, and they wouldn't let me take my toothpaste with me. If I have halitosis here tonight, blame it on these scaremongers that are running our airports. They've turned these airports into police states. It's one of the reasons I wish we had faster railways so we wouldn't have to go through all this nonsense at the airport. But all of that, in my opinion, is orchestrated by the fearmongers who want to keep this fear just as high as they can. That's how they win elections. And I hope this book in some way will help dispel these groundless and exaggerated fears.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Well, I think you will agree, ladies and gentlemen, that we've been privileged to hear two articulate, informed, wise voices speaking with candor and from experience on one of the great challenges that face our country. And if you will permit me a word of personal privilege, as they say in the House of Representatives, I remind you of what a great member of the National Arts Club, Theodore Roosevelt, said many years ago. Those who say it is unpatriotic and servile to criticize a President of the United States are treasonous to the American public. Thank you very much.
George McGovern and William Polk. For more information on their book, Out of Iraq, visit William Polk's website at williampolk.com. And you can see this program again tonight at 2 a.m.